When we first moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, I thought we had finally found the perfect place where my little girl could grow up in peace, away from the chaos of the city and the endless stares she used to get whenever we went out. My daughter, Emily, was born with a severe respiratory condition that required her to use a wheelchair most of the time and an inhaler to breathe when her lungs betrayed her. But despite all that, she was the light of my world, her laughter bubbling like music through our new home, filling every room with joy I thought I might never hear again after the struggles of her early years in hospitals, surgeries, and sleepless nights by her bedside. And I remember thinking as I carried the last box into the house that maybe, just maybe, life had finally given us a break, but I was wrong, so terribly wrong, because hiding behind the manicured lawns and the neat, white fences of Willow Creek was a predator I never expected. A woman who wore pearls around her neck, who smiled too wide when she saw us, who shook my hand just a little too hard, and who introduced herself with a pride that clung to every syllable. I'm Karen, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. And I didn't know it then, but that name would come to haunt me in ways I could never have imagined. At first, she seemed harmless, even friendly, though something about the way her eyes lingered on Emily's wheelchair unsettled me, and it wasn't long before her comments began, soft at first, little digs disguised as neighborly advice. You know, those medical supplies by your porch don't really fit the community aesthetic, or maybe Emily could play inside instead of on the sidewalk. The HOA is very particular about appearances, and I bit my tongue because I wanted to keep the peace. Because Emily was finally smiling again, and I didn't want to ruin that by picking fights. But as days turned into weeks, Karen's so-called, suggestions grew sharper, colder, cutting into the fragile comfort we had built, until I started noticing her shadow everywhere. Standing at her window with binoculars, jotting notes into a leather-bound book, whenever Emily's laughter echoed too loud across the street, and once, late at night, when I looked out her upstairs window, I caught her pacing back and forth by our mailbox, muttering to herself, her face twisted in something between disgust and determination, and though I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, the mind of a father too protective of his child, the unease gnawed at me, whispering warnings I didn't yet understand. Emily, bless her innocent soul, noticed none of it, or at least she pretended not to, because she was too busy painting pictures of butterflies and flowers, too busy making friends with the stray cat that wandered into our yard, too busy finding joy where most adults would only see limitations, and sometimes when I watched her grip that inhaler with her tiny hand and take a deep, steadying breath before laughing again, I felt an ache so deep in my chest it was hard to breathe myself, because I knew how fragile she was, how one wrong turn, one mistake, could take her away at first. I tried to tell myself that Karen's comments were nothing more than the meddling of an overzealous neighbor who had too much time on her hands, but as the weeks slipped by, her fixation on Emily became impossible to ignore, like a shadow that clung to us no matter where we went, and soon every day carried with it a new complaint, a new summons from the HOA, a new reminder that she was watching, always watching. One morning, I found a typed letter tucked under our doormat, sealed in an envelope with the Willow Creek HOA insignia embossed in gold, and inside were 3 paragraphs scolding me for allowing Emily's wheelchair to leave unsightly tire marks on the sidewalk, demanding that we either clean the pavement daily or face fines, and while I wanted to crumple the letter and throw it in her face, Emily, ever the gentle soul, just smiled and said, "It's okay, Daddy, she just doesn't understand." But I knew better. I saw the malice hiding behind the mask of professionalism, the venom coiled in every perfectly typed word. And it became even clearer when a few days later Karen cornered me by the mailbox, her perfume so strong it made my stomach turn, her smile too polished to be genuine as she leaned close and whispered, "You really should consider keeping your daughter inside more often. She's disruptive to the neighborhood atmosphere." And I felt my blood run hot, my hands clenching into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm, because I knew if I lost control, I would give her the victory she craved. Yet that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how someone could look at my little girl and see an inconvenience instead of the miracle she was. And as the days went on, Karen's harassment escalated. From words to actions, fines for leaving Emily's medical equipment visible by the porch, warnings for excessive noise whenever Emily's laughter carried through the street, even citations for unauthorized decorations when Emily painted the fence with chalk butterflies, which she adored, and while the neighbors whispered about Karen's cruelty, most stayed silent, because in Willow Creek, silence was safer than resistance, and I watched as one by one they turned their eyes away, whenever. Karen humiliated us at HOA meetings, her voice dripping with authority as she painted us as the troublemakers, the ones ruining the community standard. And though my medical practice demanded long hours and focus, I found myself devoting more and more time to studying Karen, piecing together her routines, her habits, her obsessions, until one evening I caught her standing by our porch steps, pretending to adjust her scarf while her eyes scanned Emily's inhaler lying beside her sketchbook, and something in the way her lips curled into a smirk as she walked away chilled me to the bone, a quiet premonition whispering that her hatred was no longer just about appearances or control. It was personal and it was dangerous. I tried to dismiss the thought, tried to tell myself she would never go that far. But then it happened. One afternoon, Emily had been playing with the stray cat she named Daisy, her laughter echoing through the warm summer air, when suddenly she froze, clutching her chest, her face pale as she fumbled for her inhaler, gasping for breath as panic gripped me. And though she managed to steady herself after a few desperate puffs, the sight of her trembling hands and terrified eyes seared itself into my memory. Because in that moment, I knew with unshakable certainty that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just her illness acting up, that someone had interfered with the one thing keeping her alive. And when I looked across the street, my eyes met Karen's. Through her living room window, she was standing there, sipping from a glass of wine, her smile slow, deliberate, and cruel. And though she lifted her hand in a mockery of a friendly wave, I felt as though she had just declared war. For me forever. But I swore to myself that day, as I tucked her into bed under her favorite pink blanket, that no matter what this neighborhood or its rules demanded, no matter how many fines Karen threatened us with, I would protect Emily with everything I had, because I wasn't just her father. I was also a doctor, trained to heal, trained to fight for life, and no one, not even an HOA president drunk on power, was going to take my daughter's breath away, though at the time I couldn't have imagined just how literal that promise would become, or how soon Karen would test it. It happened on a night I will never forget, a night when the air felt heavy with a silence so unnatural it pressed against my chest like a weight, and Emily, who had been coloring at the dining table, suddenly let out a strangled cough that grew sharper and harsher until she doubled over, gasping desperately as her small hands fumbled for the inhaler I had refilled only that morning, and I watched in horror as she pressed at her lips, squeezed and inhaled, but instead of relief her body convulsed, her eyes wide with panic as she clawed at her throat, her breaths coming in jagged, broken gasps that echoed through the house like a scream, and my instincts as a father collided violently with my training as a doctor as I swept her into my arms, my heart pounding so hard it threatened to shatter my ribs while my mind raced through possibilities, asthma attack, allergic reaction, contaminated medicine. But the one thing I knew for certain was that something was horribly wrong, because this was not how her inhaler was supposed to work. This was not the reaction of medicine designed to heal. This was poison, pure and deliberate, and though terror clawed at my soul, I forced my hands to stay steady as I laid her on the couch, checked her pulse, her oxygen levels, and fought to stabilize her breathing with every ounce of knowledge I had, whispering encouragement into her ear, even as her tiny body shook beneath my touch. And for one terrifying moment, I thought I was going to lose her, that her fragile lungs were going to give up and leave me clutching nothing but silence. But somehow, by a miracle or by sheer will, she began to take in shallow breaths again, enough to buy us precious seconds, and without hesitation I scooped her up, sprinted out the door, and drove like a madman to the hospital, my vision blurred by a mix of fury and fear as Emily whimpered in the back seat, whispering through trembling lips, "Daddy, it burns," words that sliced me deeper than any knife could, because I knew then that this wasn't just an asthma complication, this was chemical, something corrosive, something meant to hurt, And when we burst into the emergency room, the nurses rushed her away, attaching monitors, tubes, and masks while I barked medical terms at them like gunfire, too caught between the roles of doctor and father to know which was breaking me more. And when the toxicology results came back, the world seemed to tilt on its axis because the lab tech, pale and stammering, told me they had found traces of acid inside the residue of her inhaler, something that had no business being there, something so maliciously placed that my knees nearly buckled beneath me. And in that moment, every suspicion I had about Karen crystallized into certainty because no random accident could explain this. No manufacturer's error could account for it. This was sabotage, an attempt on my little girl's life. And as I stood in the sterile white hallway, outside her room, watching through the glass as Emily clutched a stuffed bunny to her chest and whimpered in her sleep, I felt something inside me harden, something dark and unyielding that I had never allowed myself to embrace before, the cold, calculated rage of a father who knew his enemy. And I swore then and there that whoever had dared to lay a hand on my child, whoever had poisoned the very breath from her lungs, would regret the day they crossed me because they thought they were preying on a helpless little girl. But what they didn't realize was that she was my daughter and I was a doctor, trained not just to heal, but to uncover, to analyze, to fight diseases that hid in shadows. And Karen, for all her power and all her arrogance, was nothing more than a sickness in human form, one that I was determined to cure no matter the cost. And as I drove home that night, exhaustion heavy in my bones but fire blazing in my chest, I glanced across the street to see Karen, standing in her window once again, glass of wine in hand, that same smug smile painted across her lips. And in that moment, I knew she had tried once, she would try again. And unless I stopped her, the next time might be the last. The morning after Emily's terrifying hospital stay, I sat alone in the kitchen, her inhaler lying on the table between my hands like a loaded weapon, its plastic shell innocuous, yet filled with the stench of betrayal. And though exhaustion gnawed at my body after a night without sleep, my mind blazed with a clarity sharper than any scalpel I had ever held, because I knew with certainty now that this was no accident, this was sabotage, and Karen was the only one with both the motive and the opportunity to carry it out. As a doctor, I had spent years diagnosing hidden diseases, piecing together subtle clues from lab results, patient histories, and behaviors others overlooked, and now I found myself applying those same skills not in a hospital, but in my own neighborhood, because the sickness threatening my daughter didn't live in her lungs. It lived across the street wearing pearls and a smirk. The first thing I did was gather evidence, carefully swabbing the inside of the inhaler, sealing samples in sterile containers, documenting everything with photographs and timestamps. Because if I was going to stop Karen, I needed more than suspicion, I needed proof. And as I worked, the memory of her smug wave through the window replayed in my mind like a taunt, fueling the fire already burning in my chest. Later that day, while Emily rested in bed clutching her stuffed bunny, I drove to the HOA office under the pretense of reviewing neighborhood guidelines, and what I found there chilled me further. A long record of complaints, fines, and even legal disputes filed against Karen by past residents, all of which mysteriously ended with the other family moving out, their homes quickly resold at a profit. And while no one had ever accused her of violence, the pattern was unmistakable. Karen thrived on control, on driving out those she deemed unworthy of her perfect community, and she had always gotten away with it, hidden behind rules and bylaws like a spider, spinning webs of bureaucracy. Armed with this knowledge, I began questioning neighbors quietly, one by one, careful not to reveal too much. And while most were too afraid to speak against her, a few whispered truths when no one was listening. Stories of Karen sneaking into yards late at night, of pets that mysteriously fell ill after crossing her path, of children whose toys were vandalized if they made too much noise. And though the accounts varied, they all carried the same undercurrent. Karen was dangerous, and she would stop at nothing to protect her illusion of control. Back at home, I installed hidden cameras around our porch and inside the entryway, adjusting the angles with a precision I usually reserve for surgeries, because if she dared come near Emily's inhaler again, I wanted her every move captured, Nights became long vigils at my desk, reviewing footage, analyzing chemical residues under my microscope, comparing fingerprints smudged faintly against the inhaler's surface, and each time I found the same faint traces of a foreign substance, something corrosive, acidic, deliberately placed. And though the evidence piled higher each day, it wasn't enough to put her away. Not yet, because circumstantial proof could be twisted, dismissed, laughed out of court, and Karen was too clever, too practiced at manipulation, to be undone by suspicion alone. One night, as I sat in the dim glow of my study lamp, Emily asleep upstairs, I saw movement on the live camera feed, and my breath caught as the screen flickered with the image of Karen herself, her silhouette creeping along the edge of my yard, her hands gloved, her head darting left and right like a thief, until she paused by the porch where Emily's things lay, crouching low as though inspecting something, and my pulse thundered in my ears as I leaned closer to the monitor, watching her fingers brush against the inhaler before she slipped something small from her pocket and fiddled with it in the dark. I gripped the desk, so hard my knuckles turned white, every instinct in me screaming to rush outside and catch her red-handed. But I forced myself to wait, to let the camera capture every second, every damning motion, because patience, though it tore at me, would be my weapon, and when she finally retreated back into the shadows and disappeared into her house, I sat in silence, my chest heaving, knowing I had her now, knowing I was closer to ending this nightmare, but also realizing, with a shudder, that if she was bold enough to strike again so soon, her obsession had crossed into madness, and the next attack might not be so easy to survive. The next days unfolded like a chess match played in shadows, with every glance across the street and every word exchanged at the mailbox carrying the weight of hidden war. And though I now possessed footage of Karen creeping into my yard, I knew that if I revealed my hand too early, she would twist the narrative, spin the neighbors into her loyal jury, and leave me looking like the paranoid father of a sickly child. So I tested her instead, laying traps of words and observing her reactions, greeting her with a calm smile, while casually mentioning how I had begun documenting every single HOA interaction, how I had contacts in forensics willing to help me with an unusual medical case, and though her lips curled into that familiar smirk, I saw the faintest flicker of unease in her eyes before she scoffed and replied, "Oh, doctor, always so dramatic. Maybe your daughter's condition is just worsening, and you're looking for someone to blame," her voice dripping with condescension as if the very thought of her being responsible was laughable, but beneath the mask, I could sense the tremor of fear, the twitch of guilt she tried to bury. I pushed further in subtle ways, speaking loudly at HOA meetings about safety in the neighborhood, about the importance of protecting children, watching Karen shift uncomfortably as neighbors nodded along, though none dared connect the dots out loud, and while outwardly she paraded herself as the charming, authoritative leader behind closed doors, the cracks were widening. Because her obsession with us was no longer confined to fines and warnings, she began circling our house in her car late at night, leaving anonymous notes with thinly veiled threats like, "This community isn't for everyone," and "Some families just don't belong here." And worst of all, her psychological warfare began to seep into Emily's world because one afternoon my little girl came running inside, tears streaking down her cheeks, clutching her inhaler to her chest as she stammered, "Daddy, she touched it again." And though I tried to calm her trembling body, rage thundered inside me at the thought of Karen's hands defiling the one thing keeping my daughter alive. That night, unable to sleep, I sat by Emily's bed, listening to her strained breaths, her small body curled in fear. And I realized that Karen wasn't just trying to drive us out anymore. She wanted to break us, to crush us piece by piece until either we left or Emily didn't survive. And it was then I knew patience had its limits, that I could no longer simply observe and gather proof, because while evidence might save us in court someday, Emily needed saving now. The next morning, I walked straight up to Karen as she pruned her roses, the clippers in her hand glinting in the sunlight, and I locked eyes with her, my voice calm but edged with steel as I said, "Stay away from my daughter," and for a heartbeat her smile faltered. But then she laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that made my skin crawl, and whispered, "Or what, doctor? You'll diagnose me?" Before turning her back to me, dismissing me as though I were nothing, and in that moment I understood that logic, reason, and civility would never tame the monster she had become. From then on, every encounter felt like a duel, her filing yet Another baseless complaint about our non-compliant trash bins, me responding with meticulously documented evidence disproving her lies, her rallying neighbors with sweet talk and cookies, me quietly reminding them of the fines and harassment they had suffered under her rule. And though she maintained her grip on many, I saw doubt growing in their eyes, whispers spreading behind closed doors, the seeds of her downfall beginning to sprout, and yet the more cornered she became, the more reckless her behavior turned. Until one evening, Emily vanished from a yard for nearly 2 hours, only to be found trembling behind the shed, whispering that Karen had come too close, that she had reached for her inhaler again, and, though I found no fresh tampering this time, the terror in my daughter's eyes was all the confirmation I needed that Karen's games were escalating into something far more dangerous. I carried Emily inside, holding her tighter than ever, and as I locked the doors, I made a silent vow that if Karen wanted war, then war she would have because I was done playing defense, done waiting for the next attack, and though the path ahead was fraught with risks, I began crafting a plan, a trap so precise, so undeniable, that even Karen's silver tongue couldn't twist her way out of it. And as I sat in the quiet of my study that night, reviewing the footage I had already collected, sharpening every detail of my strategy, I realized that the final act of this nightmare was about to begin, and the hunter would soon become the prey. For days, I planned in silence, studying Karen's patterns the way a surgeon studies an X-ray, dissecting every flaw until the plan was precise, foolproof, and lethal not to Emily's safety but to Karen's empire of lies, because I knew that simply accusing her would never be enough. She would deny, deflect, charm the neighbors into believing her as she always had. But if I could catch her in the act, if I could expose her with evidence so irrefutable that even her silver tongue would falter, then her downfall would be certain, and so I devised a trap using the very tool she had turned into a weapon against my daughter, the inhaler. With careful precision, I prepared a replica identical in weight, color, and design to Emily's real one, but modified inside with chemical sensors sensitive enough to detect even the faintest trace of foreign substances, sensors that would log every contact, every particle left behind, and transmit the data directly to my laptop. I coated the surface with a special powder invisible to the eye, but capable of recording fingerprints more clearly than any police dust. And then I placed the inhaler where Emily usually left hers, out on the porch beside her sketchbook and toys, while the real one I locked away safely inside the house, far from Karen's reach. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the street fell into the quiet hum of sprinklers and cicadas, I sat in the dim light of my study, the laptop glowing before me, hidden cameras, trained on the yard from every angle, my heart pounding as though I were preparing for surgery on the most delicate of patients, and I waited, every minute stretching into an eternity, until just after midnight, when the motion detector chimed softly and the screen flickered to life, showing a figure slipping through the shadows. Karen, dressed in black, her pearl necklace glinting faintly as she crept toward my porch, her movements quick and deliberate like a predator certain of its kill, and I leaned forward, every muscle taut as a bowstring, watching as she crouched by the inhaler, pulled a small vial from her pocket, and with a steady hand began unscrewing the cap. The chemical sensors spiked instantly on my screen, warning of corrosive compounds, and my stomach churned with both fury and vindication as I watched her tilt the vial, letting a single drop fall inside, then another, the camera capturing every damning second, every calculated movement of a woman poisoning a child's lifeline, and though my instinct screamed to burst out the door and stop her, I forced myself to wait until she had finished, until she slipped the inhaler back into place with a smug little pat, as though she were sealing a victory, and only then did I move, bursting through the front door with a roar that shattered the night. "Caught you!" I bellowed, my voice so loud it startled even me, and Karen froze, her eyes wide, the vial still in her trembling hand as the porch light illuminated her crime in vivid clarity. For a heartbeat, she looked like a deer trapped in headlights, but then, in true Karen fashion, she tried to recover, stammering, "This isn't what it looks like," her words hollow and desperate as she backed away. But I was already holding up my phone, showing her the live feed, recording every detail, every fingerprint, every trace of chemicals still glowing on the screen, and for the first time since we'd moved to Willow Creek, I saw real fear in her eyes, the mask of superiority cracking as her empire began to crumble. She tried to bolt, but I blocked her path, my voice low and steady as I said, "You tried to murder my daughter, and now the whole world is going to see exactly who you are." And though she spat curses at me, clawing at excuses, I knew it was over because I had everything, the footage, the chemical data, the fingerprints, the vial itself still clutched in her guilty hand. And as neighbors began peeking out from their windows, drawn by the commotion, Karen realized with dawning horror that her carefully crafted image was unraveling in real time, that no amount of HOA bylaws or manipulative charm could erase what had just been witnessed. I held her there under the harsh glare of the porch light, my daughter safe inside, my evidence secure, and though she hissed threats about ruining me, about twisting the story as she always had, I knew with unshakable certainty that this time the trap had closed, that she was finished, and as I dialed the police with steady hands, my heart thundering with both triumph and fury, I looked Karen in the eye and whispered words I had waited weeks to say. Checkmate. The flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet street in chaos as the police cars screeched to a halt, neighbors spilling out of their houses in pajamas and bathrobes, whispering in disbelief as Karen was cornered on my porch, the incriminating vial still trembling in her hand, her face pale with fury and panic. But even as the officers rushed forward, she unleashed her performance, her voice rising shrill and desperate. "He's framing me. I was only checking on the girl's medicine. He's twisting everything." And for a moment, I saw some of the neighbors' brows furrow in confusion, the same old Karen magic, attempting to weave its spell. But this time I was ready. This time I had every ounce of truth laid bare, and I raised my laptop high so all could see the live feed playing in real time. Karen unscrewing the inhaler, tilting the vial, the drops of acid glistening as they fell inside, her smug expression in the glow of the porch light, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd, shattering the illusion she had spun for years, her carefully curated mask disintegrating under the undeniable weight of evidence. The officers didn't hesitate, snapping handcuffs around her wrists as she shrieked threats, promising lawsuits, demanding the HOA board to come to her rescue. But no one moved to defend her this time, not even the neighbors she had once manipulated so easily, because truth was louder than her venom now. And as they dragged her toward the squad car, Emily peeked from the window behind me, her small voice trembling as she asked, "Daddy, is it over?" And I knelt down, my heart breaking at the fear in her eyes, whispering, "It's over, sweetheart, you're safe now." Though deep inside I knew the battle wasn't truly finished until Karen faced justice in the courtroom. The weeks that followed were grueling, filled with hearings and testimonies, Karen's high-priced lawyers trying every tactic to paint me as a vengeful father with a vendetta, twisting timelines, questioning my integrity as a doctor, even dragging Emily's condition into cruel debates about whether she had even needed the inhaler that night. But I came prepared, armed not just with my medical expertise, but with the raw, irrefutable evidence that no jury could ignore, the chemical sensor's data logs, the fingerprints lifted from the inhaler, the surveillance footage synced across multiple angles, and the vial itself still holding traces of the corrosive acid, a smoking gun. In its purest form, I stood in that courtroom, not just as a father, but as a surgeon dissecting lies, my voice steady, my knowledge undeniable, explaining to the jury in clinical but passionate detail how even a single drop of that acid would have destroyed Emily's throat, her lungs, her life. And as I spoke, I could see jurors glance toward Emily sitting quietly beside her mother in the gallery, clutching her favorite stuffed bear, her tiny chest rising and falling with the aid of the inhaler Karen had tried to corrupt, and I knew in that moment the truth had already pierced their hearts. Karen, though, never stopped. Even on the stand, she smirked and snarled, claiming I had staged the entire thing, that I had poisoned the inhaler myself to frame her. But every time her words rose, my evidence crushed them back down like a hammer breaking glass, and the final blow came when the forensic expert confirmed under oath that Karen's fingerprints, coated in the invisible powder I had placed, were perfectly preserved on the inhaler's cap, glowing like neon in the lab's photographs, a mark of guilt no defense could erase. The jury deliberated only 3 hours before returning with the verdict: guilty on all counts: attempted murder, reckless endangerment, tampering with medical equipment. And as the judge read out the sentence, 25 years with no possibility of parole, Karen finally broke, her face crumbling, the mask shattering as she screamed obscenities that echoed through the courtroom until the bailiffs dragged her away, her voice fading into nothing. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe, truly breathe, because Emily was safe, justice had been served, and the monster that haunted our neighborhood was caged forever. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Neighbors apologized for doubting us, some in tears, others in shame. But I didn't linger for interviews or vindication. I simply lifted Emily into my arms, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "No one will ever hurt you again." Knowing those words weren't just a promise, but a vow carved into my very soul, a vow I would keep until my last breath. And as we drove home, the sun breaking through storm clouds above, Emily looked out the window and smiled for the first time in weeks, a small, fragile smile that told me hope had returned. And in that moment, though the scars of what Karen had done would never fully fade, I knew we had won, not just against her, but against the darkness she represented, a victory of truth over lies, love over hate, and a father's unwavering protection over the cruelty of a woman who thought she could play God with a child's life, only to discover too late that she had picked a fight with a doctor who was also a father, and that combination was her ultimate undoing.